Yeah, so this talk is basically about an objection to contextualism that Duncan Pritchard makes. But I think like lots of anti-contextualists sort of think this kind of way. People are always saying this kind of thing to me. So yeah, it's about Pritchard, but also kind of a more sort of broad worry that people have about contextualism, I think. And I'm calling the objection the privileging skepticism objection. And basically the objection is that contextualism sort of implies that there's something better about skeptical contexts than ordinary contexts. There's something like more correct about skeptical standards than the sort of more ordinary standards that we use in other contexts. So the roadmap for my talk, I'm going to outline epistemic contextualism, and in particular, a contextualism that sort of appeals to epistemic standards, as this is kind of what's needed to get the objection going. I'm going to motivate epistemic contextualism, or at least describe why people have been found contextualism appealing by discussing skeptical paradoxes. Then I'll give what I'm calling the privileging skepticism objection to contextualism, and compare it to another objection to contextualism, which is similar, which I'm going to call the easy skeptical context objection. I'm going to dismiss the easy skeptical context objection, and then sort of reformulate the privileging skepticism objection so that you don't need to buy into the other objection. And then I'm also going to dismiss that objection by arguing that it begs the question against contextualism. Yeah, so let's get going. So epistemic contextualism is a thesis about the word knows and its cognates. And it says that these are context sensitive. So what this means is that the truth value of a sentence of the form, a subject S knows a proposition P, the truth value of this sentence can vary depending on features of the context in which it's asserted, independent of like any changes to S or P. So the same sentence, S knows P, where S has like the same evidence for P, believes P to the same degree, S is the same person, etc., can be true asserted in one context and false in another, just because of features of the conversational context. So this view is sometimes called attributor contextualism, to emphasize that it's the person who is attributing or denying knowledge whose context makes a difference to the truth conditional content of the knowledge attribution. Yeah, so contextualism is standardly fleshed out with reference to epistemic standards. These are supposed to be the standards that someone has to meet in order for it to be true in her context that she knows that P. So in contexts where the standards are low, you don't need to be in a particularly strong epistemic position with regards to a proposition P to count as knowing that proposition. But in contexts where the standards are higher, you have to be in a stronger epistemic position in order to count as knowing the same proposition, even if you have the same evidence. So for example, in the pub, it's quite easy for me to know, for example, that Emily has a twin sister. It's sufficient for my knowing this, for example, that Emily told me that she has a twin sister. But in a context where I'm being questioned by the police over whether I can corroborate Emily's story that it wasn't her, but her twin sister who robbed the bank, it's plausible that it's not sufficient for my counting as knowing that Emily has a twin sister, that she told me she has a twin sister. For it to be true that I know that Emily has a twin sister in this context, plausibly I have to have met her sister myself, or even stronger, I need to have met their whole family or like seen their birth records, or I don't know, so something more is needed essentially. So that's epistemic contextualism. A primary motivation for becoming a contextualist is this idea that it can give quite a neat solution to skeptical paradoxes. So consider these three statements. The first one is, I know that I have hands. This is just an ordinary piece of knowledge that you would take yourself to know in your day-to-day life. Two is, if I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat, henceforth a BIV. This is an instance of a closure principle, or it's maybe a transmission principle. I don't really think that matters for the purposes of my talk. But here I'm calling it closure. This is sort of in line with like what John Hawthorne and Tim Williamson said like 20 years ago. So this is just an instance of this closure principle. If S knows that P and S knows that if P then Q, S can come to know that Q by deducing it from P if P then Q. And then the third statement is I can't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. This is supposed to be quite intuitive just if you reflect on the kinds of things you might say if someone asked you whether you know that you're not a brain in a vat. It seems that there isn't really any kind of evidence that you can appeal to. Oh, I don't know why this says that I have hands. Well, the idea is like the kind of evidence that you would normally appeal to know such things as that I have hands are things like, it looks to me like I have hands, yada, yada. But you can't appeal to this kind of evidence to say that you know that you're not a brain in a vat. And so from 2 and 3, we get, I don't know that I have hands. And this is quite clearly incompatible with 1. Hence we have a paradox. And this is a problem because all of these first 3 statements are meant to be things that are difficult to deny. So just a terminological note, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about radical skeptical possibilities to refer to such possibilities as that I'm a brain in a vat. And these possibilities have 2 key features. So the first feature of these possibilities is the proposition P that's under consideration as known or not known. So in this case, that I have hands. This proposition is false in the radical skeptical possibility. So in the brain in a vat possibility, it's false that I know that I have, or it's false that I have hands because I'm just a brain. And the second feature of radical skeptical possibilities is that these possibilities can't be distinguished from a possibility in which P by appeal to how things seem to 1. Okay, so reflecting on the radical skeptical possibility that I know that I have hands, that I don't know that I'm, reflecting on the radical skeptical possibility that I might be a brain in a vat leads me to think that I can't rule this out based on how things seem to me, and so that I don't know that I have hands. So what the contextualist says about this is we don't need to outright give up any of the statements 1 to 3, even though we end up with this paradox. Rather, what we should say is that 1 to 3 can't all be true together. They can't all be true at the same time. But nevertheless, we can still say that we know that we have hands in context when we're not thinking about skeptical paradoxes. So the contextualist makes an argument roughly as follows, although different contextualists fill in the details differently. Before considering the radical skeptical possibility that I'm a brain in a vat, I get to count as knowing that I have hands. So 1 is true when I first utter it or when I first consider it. But when I consider 2, I'm alerted to the possibility that I might be a brain in a vat. And now that this possibility is on the table, I no longer count as knowing that I have hands, because in this context, for whatever reason, in order to know that I have hands, I now have to be able to rule out the not P possibility in which I'm a brain in a vat. So in this new context, 4 is true and 1 is false. But this is supposed to be fine for non-skeptics, because once we've forgotten about the possibility that I might be a brain in a vat, I get to count as knowing that I have hands once again. So what the contextualist takes herself to have done here is to have explained why we might find the sort of pull, why we might feel the pull of skepticism when we consider arguments like this. The reason is that it's literally true now that I'm considering this paradox. It's true that I don't know that I have hands. But the contextualist explains this skeptical pull without making it the case that I don't get to count as knowing ordinary propositions in my day-to-day life. So yeah, this is supposed to be an sort of elegant solution to the skeptical paradox. But it does make one substantial concession to the skeptic, right? The contextualist is conceding that whenever we consider possibilities, like that I might be a brain in a vat, it immediately becomes true that we don't get to know such ordinary propositions as that we have hands, or at least when we think about these possibilities in the right kinds of contexts. So Duncan Pritchard writes of the contextualist solution to the paradox: the attributed contextualist resolution of the radical skeptical problem effectively involves conceding, in the philosophical context of epistemic appraisal in which one engages with the problem, that the sentences that the radical skeptic asserts regarding our epistemic position express truths. It's thus no wonder that we get taken in by this problem, since whenever we consider it, we're thereby in a context of epistemic appraisal in which the skeptic's assertions are true. And like I said, this is supposed to be palatable to anti-skeptical epistemologists and also to ordinary speakers, because the contextualist has it that we still get to know these propositions in ordinary life. But Pritchard argues that the contextualist is actually conceding more to the skeptic than this. And he claims that the contextualist analysis of the skeptical paradox actually involves a privileging of skeptical epistemic standards over the more lax standards of ordinary contexts. So so in this quote, you can see it's, he says, if we follow through on our basic epistemic commitments, radical skepticism qua position will be correct. Oh, this is a new quote. Okay. The attributed contextualist concedes that the radical skeptic is employing more demanding standards for no's than are operative in our everyday contexts. But doesn't this effectively cede the epistemological high ground to the radical skeptic? The upshot of attributed contextualism seems to be that if we were to follow through on our basic epistemic commitments, the paradox will disappear for the simple reason that radical skepticism will be correct. Our only protection against this eventuality is to blink ourselves to the radical skeptical context of epistemic appraisal. And he carries on saying that under contextualism, skeptical contexts occupy a privileged epistemic position, i.e. one in which more demanding epistemic standards are applicable. So the idea is that there's like a normative ranking of contexts for the contextualist. She's ceding the epistemological high ground to the skeptic by allowing that the skeptic standards are more demanding. So call this Pritchard's privileging skepticism objection to contextualism. This objection is closely related to, but not the same as, another objection that's frequently made to contextualism, which is that the view makes it too easy to induce contexts in which knowledge attributions that would ordinarily be true come out false. So according to contextualism, so the objection goes, merely mentioning or otherwise making salient a radical skeptical possibility is going to be enough to destroy our knowledge of any proposition incompatible with that possibility. So Fredretsky writes that contextualism has it that asking a subject whether they, the things he knows to be oranges, are not wax imitations, destroys the knowledge that he had, that they are oranges. Michael Williams writes that as radical skeptical possibilities can't be ruled out by appeal to how things seem to us, then a person's knowledge vanishes every time such a possibility enters his head. And Elke Brendel writes that if we think of knowledge as a cognitive state, then contextualism allows that we, as knowledge ascribers, can change or even destroy a certain cognitive state of a person to whom we have no contact at all, just by reflecting on skeptical hypotheses. So call this the easy skeptical context objection to contextualism. However, these ways of putting the objection aren't quite right. It isn't the case that for the contextualist, knowledge vanishes or is destroyed whenever radical skeptical possibilities are made salient. Rather, what happens is that when these possibilities are on the table, then knowledge attributions that would ordinarily be true turn out to be false. And as Jonathan Ichikawa writes, to force a context in which knows does not apply is no more to destroy knowledge than is to force a context in which everybody does not apply to destroy everybody. So Dretsky, Williams, and Brendel are here committing what Keith DeRose calls the fallacy of semantic dissent. They're making the mistake of holding it against a theory or view that it has a certain implication, when in fact its real implication is not what we think, but rather some higher level statement. So they're objecting that contextualism allows that attending to radical skeptical hypotheses destroys knowledge. Really what contextualism does is it makes it so that ordinarily true knowledge attributions come out false in contexts in which these possibilities are under consideration. But that's still a problem. And the objection is put more carefully by Michael Hannon, who argues that merely mentioning a radical skeptical possibility shouldn't have the power to induce a context in which S knows P becomes false for any P that's incompatible with that possibility. So here he's borrowing an example from David Lewis, and he argues that a jury that must decide whether Jones shot Smith may still properly ignore the possibility raised in the following desperate proclamation. Ladies and gentlemen, I must point out that the prosecutor has failed to rule out the possibility that it was not Jones, but rather Smith's dog, marvelously well trained, that fired the fatal shot. So if Hannon's right that the jury might rightly be said to know that Jones is guilty, even if they haven't ruled out the possibility that Smith was shot by his own dog, then it isn't plausible that merely mentioning a not P possibility is sufficient for inducing a context in which that possibility has to be ruled out for someone to count as knowing P. And it follows that mentioning a radical skeptical possibility shouldn't suffice for inducing a skeptical context in which you can't count as knowing any P incompatible with that radical skeptical possibility. So I think Pritchard hints at the easy skeptical context objection when he says that under contextualism, our only protection against skepticism is to blinker ourselves to the radical skeptical context of appraisal. And this objection, the easy skeptical context objection, is actually quite well motivated, insofar as there are contextualists who would sign up to what Hannon calls the mere mention view, i.e. there are contextualists who think that merely mentioning a not P possibility is sufficient for making that one that has to be ruled out for S knows P to be true. So David Lewis is one such contextualist. He endorses what he calls the rule of attention, which says that no matter how far-fetched a certain possibility may be, no matter how properly we might have ignored it in some other context, if in this context we're not ignoring it, but attending to it, then for us now it is a relevant alternative. So Lewis's rule of attention has it that as soon as we are attending to, as soon as it's brought to our attention that there is a not P possibility that's compatible with our evidence, immediately we don't count as knowing P until we can show that actually this possibility is not compatible with our evidence. So for Lewis, any not P possibility that's made salient in a context has to be ruled out in order for S knows P to be true. Hannon calls any contextualism that accepts this or something like it the mere mention view. And it is pretty implausible that this should suffice for making possibilities relevant. But it's not essential to the contextualist project that you endorse the rule of attention or anything like it. In fact, many contextualists explicitly deny that they would accept a rule like this. So Michael Hannon is a contextualist at this point, and he writes, no contextualist should accept the mere mention view. A more plausible idea is that in order for an alternative to be relevant, it must not only be mentioned in a context, but also taken seriously. Similarly, Michael Bloom-Tillman writes that merely attending to or directing one's mind towards some possibility W in a context C is not enough for making it impossible to ignore C, W, in the epistemologically relevant sense. The notion of ignoring I have in mind is not that of ignoring as opposed to attending to, but rather of ignoring W as opposed to taking W seriously. And also Jonathan Ichikawa writes that it's not enough to attend to a possibility to force it into relevance. Rather, we have to attend to possibilities in a certain kind of way, roughly a taking seriously. Okay, so if it isn't essential to contextualism that merely mentioning or otherwise making salient a not P possibility makes that possibility one that must be ruled out by S's evidence in order for S knows P to be true, then the easy skeptical context objection basically loses its bite, because merely mentioning or otherwise making salient a radical skeptical possibility isn't going to be enough to induce a skeptical context in which most of our ordinarily true knowledge attributions come out false. And so Pritchard's characterization of the contextualist response to the skeptical paradox is kind of misguided. It's a bit outdated because he's assuming that anyone who accepts epistemic contextualism has to accept that merely mentioning a radical skeptical possibility is enough to induce a skeptical context. But rather, if we endorse a sort of taking seriously contextualism like those articulated here, then we can attend to the skeptical paradox. But if we don't take seriously the possibilities that are raised by those by the paradox, then a skeptical context isn't forced upon us. Okay, so the easy skeptical context objection can be diffused. But I said that Pritchard's privileging skepticism objection goes further than the easy skeptical context objection. So Pritchard isn't only claiming that under contextualism, skeptical contexts get induced whenever skeptical possibilities are on the table. He's also arguing further that the contextualist is committed to there being something epistemically better about the skeptic's preferred standards. Something epistemically better about skeptical contexts than to ordinary contexts. So according to Pritchard, the contextualist endorses an explicit hierarchy of contexts, atop which sits the skeptical context. She cedes in conceding that the radical skeptic is employing more demanding standards for no's than are operative in our everyday contexts. The contextualist cedes the epistemological high ground to the radical skeptic. And skeptical contexts are privileged over ordinary contexts, according to Pritchard, because they are the contexts that would be induced if we were to follow through on our basic epistemic commitments in the face of radical skeptical possibilities. So again, Pritchard seems to take the contextualist to be committed to a normative ranking of contexts, with the skeptical context at the top, and not simply descriptive claims about how and when skeptical contexts get induced under contextualism. So we can pull apart Pritchard's privileging skepticism objection from the easy skeptical context objection, so that it doesn't require for its effectiveness that the contextualist accepts the mere mention view. So it may be that under contextualism, a skeptical context can only be induced if the speakers in that context or the knowledge attributors in that context take seriously a radical skeptical possibility. But skeptical contexts are nevertheless, in some sense, epistemically privileged over ordinary contexts, precisely because they are the contexts that would be induced if the speakers were to follow through on their epistemic commitments. So the skeptical context occupies the epistemological high ground, whether or not it's easily induced, simply because these contexts have in place more demanding epistemic standards than are in place in ordinary contexts. So we can choose to ignore the skeptic's epistemic standards when we refuse to take seriously radical skeptical possibilities. But if we were to face up to our epistemic responsibilities, Pritchard's idea seems to be, we'd see that these standards are nevertheless those that we should be endorsing if we're contextualists. So skeptical contexts are therefore better than ordinary contexts for contextualists because they employ the standards that we should be employing the rest of the time, or so the objection goes. So in order to avoid privileging skepticism in this way, Pritchard says that the contextualist needs to show that skeptical contexts are in some way epistemically defective. So he writes, the crux of the matter is that what we want from a response to radical skepticism is a way of showing that there's something illegitimate about this context of epistemic appraisal, such that it's deprived of the epistemic high ground. But this is way too strong. So to show that there's nothing objectively better about skeptical contexts, the contextualist doesn't need to show that there's something objectively worse about those contexts. And in fact, for a contextualist to think that skeptical contexts are defective or otherwise illegitimate would be to privilege anti-skepticism, in a way that runs contrary to essential tenets of contextualism, which is neutrality, neutrality between skepticism and anti-skepticism. So for the contextualist, there is no such thing as knowing P simpliciter. There's only knowing P according to the standards of a given context. So as Martin Montminy emphasizes, it's crucial to this claim that the contextualist does not favor one set of epistemic standards over another. So neither skeptical nor anti-skeptical standards for knowledge are supposed to better characterize what are the objectively most correct standards for knowledge, simply because there are no such standards according to a contextualist. And as such, neither skeptical nor anti-skeptical contexts are supposed to be more or less legitimate, at least from the perspective of any or from the perspective of no context. What the contextualist should show, I think, if she's to avoid privileging skepticism in the way that Pritchard says she does, is that from the perspective of a non-skeptical context, there's nothing epistemically better about the skeptical context. There's nothing more correct about the skeptic standards. And in the rest of my paper, I'm going to try to do just this. And I'm going to try and do this by appealing to the function of our talk of knowledge. So Pritchard is right that under contextualism, the skeptic is demanding more, the skeptic is employing more demanding standards for no's than those which we employ in ordinary contexts. But it doesn't follow that because they are more demanding, they are therefore more correct. And in fact, I think that Pritchard is begging the question against the epistemic contextualist, because he's here assuming that no's and its cognates don't behave like other context-sensitive terms. Because for other sort of uncontroversially context-sensitive terms, we can easily see how some contexts call for more demanding standards for those terms, without thinking that the term is being employed more correctly, objectively in those contexts. So for example, gradable adjectives are uncontroversially context-sensitive. Gradable adjectives are adjectives that come in degrees. So for example, tall is a gradable adjective. You can be really tall, or you can be quite tall, or you can be not tall at all. The idea is there's a sort of connection to a scale of tallness. And tall is context sensitive. So for example, I'm 5'9". As a woman, this is usually enough to qualify me as tall in the context of philosophy seminars. However, if I were to attend the Scottish women's basketball tryouts, being 5'9" would not be enough to qualify me as being tall. But nevertheless, if we suppose that in a philosophy seminar, the speaker asks if anyone can get a whiteboard marker off the top of a bookcase, someone might say, yeah, ask Lilith to get it, she's tall. And if another person objected, Lilith's not tall, you should see female basketball players, they're tall. If someone said this, we would just dismiss her interjection as irrelevant, because her standards for tallness, i.e. that you have to be tall compared to a basketball player, are just not relevant to our purposes in talking about tallness in this context. And our purposes in talking about tallness are finding out if anyone could get a whiteboard marker off the top of a bookcase. And because of this, there's no temptation to say that the person who is employing these more demanding standards for tallness in this context is thereby employing more correct standards for tallness. And in fact, I think that we would reject her interjection as irrelevant suggests that maybe her standards for tallness are like less correct in this context than less demanding standards, by which I would count as tall. And this is because adopting her standards for tallness would frustrate our purposes in talking about tallness in the first place. Similarly, think about the gradable adjective empty. A container is truly called empty if and only if there are no things inside it. But what counts as something inside the container will vary between contexts. So in a context where two scientists are discussing whether, or they're measuring the number of particles in a container with oxygen particles inside won't count as empty. But if I ask my flatmate if the fridge is empty because I'm hungry, And she says, no, the fridge isn't empty because there are oxygen particles inside. Her demanding standards don't seem to be more correct by virtue of their being more demanding, because in the context that we're in, for our purposes in talking about emptiness, particles don't count as things. For something to be a thing in this context, it has to be large enough to eat, for example. And again, I don't think there's any temptation to say that being more demanding makes her standards for emptiness better than my more lax standards. Or in this case, what are my standards? I don't know if that's more lax or not. You can work that out. And again, her more demanding standards maybe seem less correct because they are frustrating my purposes in asking whether the fridge is empty in the first place. So I think there are going to be cases like this for knowledge talk as well, where there's no temptation to say that someone who's employing more demanding standards for no's is thereby employing more correct standards, because their more demanding standards frustrate our purposes in talking about knowledge. So here's a case that's offered by Martin Montminy. Suppose a few history students are working together on an essay concerning the extent of Richard Nixon's knowledge during his presidency of the Watergate cover-up. Tony, one of the students, remembers an epistemology class about skepticism and says, but wait, was he in a position to rule out the possibility that he is a brain in a vat? Clearly, Tony is losing sight of the purpose of their assignment, which makes it legitimate to presuppose that there's an external world about which they, as well as Nixon, are not massively mistaken. Tony's conversational partners point this out to him, and the mentioned error possibility is quickly dismissed by all as irrelevant. So in this case, I find it really intuitive that Tony's attempts to impose his skeptical standards, the fact that this is rejected by all his conversational participants, suggests that his standards aren't better for being more demanding. And in fact, the response of his conversational participants saying that's just irrelevant, it suggests that given the purposes of their inquiry, i.e. determining how much Nixon knew about the Watergate cover-up, his standards are actually less correct. And in a skeptical context, from the perspective of this context, would be a worse context epistemically. So if this is plausible, then the contextualist is not committed to there being anything better about skeptical standards just because they are more demanding. And in fact, that Pritchard thinks that she is so committed, I think turns on a deep-seated anti-contextualist bias that no's won't behave like other context-sensitive terms. So Pritchard is asking the contextualist to show, if she is to avoid privileging skepticism, that skeptical contexts are always illegitimate in some way, they're always defective in some way. But all that it's reasonable to demand of the contextualist is that she shows that from outside of a skeptical context, from a non-skeptical context, there's nothing better about these standards. And I think that she can do that. This kind of example shows us that from the point of view of this context in which we are engaged in an inquiry that requires that we presuppose against skeptical possibilities, I think that skeptical standards are obviously no better than more lax standards from the perspective of this context. And even more strongly than I need, I think that such standards are worse from the perspective of that context. And in this way, no's mirrors the behavior of other context-sensitive terms. So just like gradable adjectives, our purposes in talking about tallness, our purposes in talking about emptiness, can make a difference to what are the correct standards for tallness or emptiness in that context. Okay, yeah, so just to summarize, that Pritchard thinks that holding that the radical skeptic is employing more demanding standards for no's, thereby cedes the epistemological high ground to the skeptic. And